particularly interesting for me to give this talk in the wake of the Pentagon's decision to open combat to women. Having spent a great deal of time thinking about women's role in combat, I can tell you that their experiences were very similar to African Americans. And it raises the question of, what does it mean to be on the battlefield when you are unequal?
This is the Miller Center Forum from the University of Virginia. I'm Doug Blackman. Today we begin a special series examining the proliferation of violence through war, civil unrest, and criminality, and its impact on human societies. We will bring together the nation's leading scholars and practitioners around efforts to understand, contain, and remediate the impact of war, warfare, and violence. Our guest today is Kimberly Phillips, Dean of the School of Humanities and Social Sciences at Brooklyn College, and author most recently of War, What Is It Good For? Black Freedom Struggles and the U.S. Military from World War II to Iraq. In her new book, Phillips plunges into the paradox of African American patriotism coupled with continuing racial discrimination that marked the Black experience in the U.S. military for much of the past century. Please welcome to the Miller Center, Kimberly Phillips.
Thank you, Doug. And I want to thank the Miller Center for this invitation. I especially want to thank Christina Lopez for organizing my trip here. I've lived in Virginia, for about 30 years, off and on, so I was used to the snow. So when I woke up this morning, I was thinking, but I'm glad to see you, and thank you for coming. I think it's particularly interesting for me to give this talk in the wake of the Pentagon's decision to open combat to women. I actually think they're finally acknowledging women's presence in combat, and it's extraordinary. It means that they will receive combat pay, and it means most certainly that they will be trained thoroughly for combat. And having spent a great deal of time thinking about women's role in combat over the past 2 decades, I can tell you that their experiences were very similar to African Americans during World War II and the Korean War. And it raises the question of, what does it mean to be on the battlefield when you are unequal, not just at home, but in the military? And it puts you in grave danger. So congratulations to the Pentagon for recognizing women's right to fight. However you might feel about war and violence, to send our soldiers onto the field and not fully trained and not fully recognized is unconscionable. And so it is their choice to be there, and they should have the right to be there fully. I grew up in the military. I am what you call an Army brat, so I did not come to this story lightly. But I'm also trained as a labor historian, so it wasn't a topic that I took up because of my background. I actually took it up because a student asked me a question about Jimi Hendrix. And I grew up listening to Jimi Hendrix. My father was a paratrooper, commander in the 173rd when it went into Vietnam in 1966. They dropped about 10 tons in 10 minutes, and he was in that jump. And so I knew about Jimi Hendrix. I listened to Jimi Hendrix all my life. But I did not remember that he had been in the 101st Airborne. And the student, asked me, Professor Phillips, was Hendrix against the war or was he for it? And so, well, that's a really interesting question. So, I went back and I listened to a lot of his music and began to recover his life. And I came to realize this very important point. Hendrix never spoke out against the war. He may have played music that may have suggested his take on the war, but he never spoke out against the Vietnam War. And as I began to do the research, I really discovered that we knew very little about the African American experience on the battlefield and how that had changed and shaped Black perspectives about the desegregated military, which occurred after World War II. And so, like a good historian, you get a problem and you begin to disentangle it. And, I thought, I really do not want to write a book about the military. I'm a labor historian. But as I begin to shape it and discover, many strands and figuring out how to weave it together, I thought, I am going to do a labor history. I'm going to write a book about the work of killing and that experience of that work that fell increasingly and disproportionately to young black men at a moment when their civil rights struggles was disentangling as well. And it became very interesting for me to poke at one of the foundational claims that the desegregation of the military was one of the most important civil rights gains. And I then had to recover some parts of my own personal history. In 1971, my father coming home with data from the Pentagon, from the Black Caucus, and revealing that only 2% of the Black officer corps in 1971, this is 1971, at the height of the Vietnam War, only 2% of the Black officer corps was in the Army, and Black troops comprised about 14%. And how could you, in fact, explain this imbalance? And going back through this, I thought, these are very interesting questions, and it demands my attention. I could not ignore it anymore. And hence, war, what is it good for? Black freedom struggles in the U.S. military. And what I attempted to do over several years was not write a history of the United States military, nor did I attempt to write a history of race in the United States military. Those books still need to be written. We know too little about the experiences of Mexican Americans in the military, or Puerto Ricans, who tens of thousands of Puerto Ricans would go into the military and still serve in the military, or the role of non-citizens in the military. Rather, I attempted to find a way of rethinking post-World War II Black history. So as I did this, I thought, well, what material am I going to use? And that's when I turned to Edwin Starr, and that's where I'm going to begin today. The title comes from Edwin Starr's monstrous hit, 1970 hit, which was a Motown hit. Starr was the second to record war. The first was from the Temptations in 1968. It's interesting, pick it up, and so I'm going to mention music today that I want you to go back to and listen to, and I'm hoping as I speak for the next few minutes that you're aware of this music. But if you listen to the Temptations version, it's very bluesy, it's the Temptations. It's that hopeful Motown sound. But when you pick up Starr's version with its drum beats and its drum rolls, you have something very, very different. And you go back, and all of you who might have it, please listen. But I'm going to walk you through it for the next minute or two because I think it's important and it sets the stage for my remarks over the next few minutes. An immediate hit single, Edwin Starr's 1970 version of War, captured the range of African Americans' debates about soldiers compelled onto battlefields and into military police actions while their struggles for freedom at home remained unfinished. War, a minister thundered. What is it good for? The congregation roared back, absolutely nothing. Beheaded women attended to the dead, crying, war can't give life, it can only take it away. Veterans from wars past deliberated how they say we must fight to keep our freedom, but Lord knows there's got to be a better way. While their mothers mourned at the frequent funerals, their sons and daughters mocked from the streets. Induction, then destruction, who wants to die? Starr, who was a veteran, and the Motown Funk Brothers, nearly all veterans, captured the complex meanings of war to African Americans who had spent most of the 20th century in a struggle for the right to fight. Drum rolls mimic the skilled swagger of men on the front line. A soldier exhales, war, as he snaps and thrusts his bayonet. Tambourines replicate the rapid repeat of M16s, and horns blast like shrill bombs. At the song's end, the drum paces the precise and solemn pivot of an honor guard at a soldier's funeral. As more young men march off to war, cymbals sound like machine guns letting loose their terrible yet infectious rhythm. In this neighborhood, like other black neighborhoods since 1941, military went door to door and military police went door to door and escorted men from the lowest income groups into the induction centers in record numbers. Star's single, which captured the menace and pride of war, gained popularity at a time when black soldiers were barred from burial in national cemeteries in the South, and when integrated military honor guards sent to bury soldiers were told by some towns to leave by sundown. Agitated by decades of too little work and barriers to full citizenship, including veterans' benefits, resistant to the disproportionate numbers of black men drafted, injured, and killed in combat, the old and the young, women and their daughters, veterans and their sons debated, how did killing and dying in war make them citizens? How did expensive wars help their struggles for racial and economic justice? How did killing in war bring freedom? Jimi Hendrix's Machine Gun, another song released in 1970, organized a complex percussive and electronic dissonance into a soundscape of combat that recovered fear and doubt of young men trained to kill other human beings. The 12-minute and 30-second song, yes, 12 minutes and 30 seconds, began with Buddy Miles' snare drum, sounding the rapid repeat of the machine gun, with Hendrix's rapid chord changes echoing like return fire. In this sonic firefight, Hendrix distilled a soldier's encounter with the enemy into one grim moment: kill or be killed. Machine gun, yeah, tearing my buddies all apart. Evil man make me kill you, evil man make you kill me, even though we are only families apart. While war suggested African Americans' doubts that combat advanced their quest for full citizenship, Machine Gun revealed soldiers' resistances to the racial and class inequalities of the battlefield. As these young soldiers face each other's M16s in their hands, they recognize that they are both brown, one from the poor streets of Chicago, the other from a village in Vietnam, just families apart. In Hendrix's lamentation, these poor and disfranchised men who do the work of killing, these children sent to fight a war, ask why. Then they audaciously dream of peace. No guns, no bombs, let's all just live and live, instead of killing. Hendrix lived this history of young and poor black men who turned to the military for work, learned to kill in U.S. wars, and then asked why. Hungry and unemployed, he twice faced charges of grand theft auto in 1961. Rather than go to jail, he enlisted and volunteered for the 101st Airborne. Like many of his peers, he considered the military steady work, 3 meals a day, a prospect he did not find elsewhere in American life. As his airborne unit trained for Vietnam, Hendrix deliberately injured himself and claimed mental instability and a lot of other things at the same time. He was discharged and went on to become a musician. By 1969, many of his childhood friends had been drafted into combat units. His younger brother, Leon, had gone AWOL. Hendrix was actually housing him at the time. Hendrix's Machine Gun and his many incendiary interpretations of the Star-Spangled Banner challenged the myth that national regeneration emerged from war. His body contorted and his electric guitar shrieking like bombs. In machine gun fire, Hendrix pierced the popular perception that black freedom would arise from carnage on the battlefield. By the way, paratroopers loved to listen to Hendrix because they believed he captured the experience of jumping out of airplanes. Since the early 20th century, many African Americans consider the right to fight, equal participation in the military, and their competency in combat critical to their claims of full citizenship. While many African Americans described the World War II segregated military, where I began, as the most anti-democratic institution in America, they also demanded equal right to contribute to the welfare and defense of the country, and true citizenship, they said, included their equal participation on the battlefield. First-class citizenship, civil rights leader Rayford Logan argued in 1944, included equality of opportunity in the military, full participation in battle. Many supporters of an integrated battlefield argued would give them a platform to make claims for equal citizenship. And I must pause and say that African Americans during World War II were serving in combat in hidden units. They were volunteer, and they were, let's also be clear, they were first on the battlefield and the last to leave. They laid the roads and laid the bombs, and they were the last to leave as they picked up the bodies and inventoried them and buried the dead. And so they were very much in combat. But the claim was that they were incompetent in combat. Despite study after study, the military loved to do studies, and one of the things that I worked through were these studies to show there's no evidence at all. What they did have evidence about was that segregated units were not ideal because anybody in segregated units tended to be poorly trained and poorly equipped, which was also revealed during the Korean War. Why weren't African Americans pulled into combat units? Because it was often the ways in which racial inequality would work, and making claims to white men that they would not serve alongside black troops, and the ways in which they would claim to men in the 1970s that they would not serve alongside women, that the sort of benefits of manhood necessitated segregation along racial and gender lines. And thus it was a sell to many young men. Interestingly enough, many white troops weren't buying that argument either. They would prefer to serve alongside somebody as very well trained rather than serve alongside somebody poorly trained. And so, many people in the military would begin to argue that segregation was a problem. It was expensive to maintain. It fueled low morale, and it became a PR problem. As the military went into Europe and Asia after World War II, they were repeatedly asked, why do you bring two armies, one white and one black? And so, as soldiers said, it's the most anti-democratic institution. And certainly many in American life believed that full equality should not extend to African Americans, despite their participation in World War II. 80% of white Americans polled by Gallup in 1945 believed that African Americans should not have full rights, despite having served admirably in the military. But the military also began to study that they needed African American labor. They needed it on the ground, and they needed it on the battlefield. And it was these studies that African Americans in the Civil Rights Movement began to build upon, and they pressed Harry Truman in 1948 in a variety of ways. Through civil rights agitation, they worked with labor to agitate. But A. Philip Randolph would take to the streets, to the airway, to the pulpit, and he too began to survey African Americans. And 76% of black men in 1946 and early 1947 said they would not serve in a segregated military, and they claimed they would go on strike. And that claim shook the Truman administration, and it resulted in him issuing Executive 9981. Now, if you pick up that order, you'll read it, and I urge you all to pick it up and read it. You will not find the word integration, nor will you find the word desegregation. What you will find is that the order would call for equal opportunity and equal treatment. The Army saw that claim is that the only equal opportunity they had would be to be drafted, and that was it. And the U.S. military went to Korea with a military that was as or nearly as segregated as it had been in World War II. Only the Air Force had done, the new Air Force had done some desegregation. The Navy solved the problem by simply removing African Americans from its service. They had 2 officers, and they had about 17 enlisted personnel. But the Korean War would demand that they accelerate their reintroduction to ships. Still, African Americans were serving in segregated units, and claims about their cowardice filtered through the American press, even though it appears
that all American troops were running for their lives, poorly trained, poorly equipped. The war in Korea was a disaster, and it would be the need for combat labor, the need for blacks on the battlefield that would lead to the desegregation of some units. And let's be very clear about that. What we would see would be the desegregation of combat infantry units. And that meant that over the next 2 decades, African Americans were disproportionately drafted into these units, and they would be forced into those units in a variety of ways in which we can talk about it. And I think it's important to talk about how people are pressed into service in what appears to be a voluntary way. And it would be their large presence that eased the pressure to draft white men, especially middle-class white men, well into the 1960s. Nonetheless, civil rights leaders believed that the desegregation of the military, they hoped the desegregation of the military would lead to the end of Jim Crow in all parts of American life, which then would prove to be elusive. These practices had deadly consequences for African Americans, not just abroad and on the battlefield, but at home. And unbeknownst to many Americans, African Americans were engaged in a lively debate, sometimes contentious debate, about citizenship and service in the military, and about whether or not military service was necessary for them to achieve not just equality, but racial justice. And indeed, I think the heart of my study really probes this claim. Can you be a citizen? Can you claim full citizenship without serving in the military? And I think many of us would say yes, but part of the rhetoric of the 20th century has been linking that service to citizenship, and that indeed some who serve in the military, their service reverberates to their communities and reverberates to their families, and that in fact military service is a communal service. It is not simply something that an individual takes up, but rather has an impact on a group and on their rights. And indeed, part of the rhetoric against African Americans and their full citizenship in the middle of the 20th century and well into the late 20th century has been about military service, whether or not they served fully in combat and the like. And as this debate continued into the 1960s, and African Americans found themselves disproportionately in the military and having little control about how they were drafted, the debates within black communities grew. W.E.B. Du Bois, who had been one of the strongest proponents of an integrated military and for blacks' right to fight during World War I, began to rethink this during World War II. And he argued in the aftermath of World War II that how wars waged by the United States against other nations allowed for indiscriminate and systematic violence against its own citizens. And much of his work that he would write from about 1937, if you pick up Black Reconstruction and you continue through his writings, which reached a global audience in the 1950s and the like, he links the ways in which military violence abroad impacted African Americans and other people of color at home. The killings of Indians in the West, he argued, in the 1870s and 1880s, prepared troops, including black troops, to kill civilians in Cuba and the Philippines between 1898 and 1903. U.S. troops called Afro-Cubans and Filipinos the Indians of the Caribbean and the South Pacific. During these wars, violence against African Americans and other non-whites in the United States soared. It is not coincidence that we have many, many racial riots in the context of war. And historians have rightly, I think, seen these as labor riots, but I would also argue that many of the people involved in these riots tend to be young men, some fresh off the battlefield or subject to the battlefield. To give you an example, 1943, the Zoot Suit riots in Los Angeles, which pitted Mexican-American, African-American, and white men, many of them on their way to the South Pacific or just coming back off of those naval ships. The Vietnam War epic is notable for the coincidence of riots in the U.S. and on military bases, ships, and prisons. We often talk about the riots that erupted in the United States, but they were intimately linked to the riots that were happening throughout military bases. In 1970, 1971 alone, there were 1,700 riots on naval ships coming out of Vietnam into the Mediterranean and into Europe. One of my father's first jobs in Europe in 1971 was to go on those ships and negotiate with soldiers, black soldiers, and their officers. This is a hidden history that we are just now recovering the records from. And so there's a distinct relationship between these military riots and what's going on at home. In the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, the military has used tactics honed in the Black, Latino, and Arab American neighborhoods in the United States, and they took those tactics into Abu Ghraib. They are now have returned from Iraq and Afghanistan in cities like New York, where stop and frisk happens. And as a New Yorker now, transplanted New Yorker, I would argue sitting on the subway nearly every day, I see a stop and frisk. And many of the young men who were being stopped and frisked are recent returnees from Afghanistan and Iraq. And it's very, very interesting to watch that happen. And so the militarization of Black communities occurred alongside these wars. And thus, by the 1960s, the idea of combat as a right and a declaration of Black citizenship no longer retained its rhetorical and organizing power for civil rights activists or ordinary Black people. On the contrary, most African Americans considered their high presence in the lower ranks of the military as evidence of their political and economic inequality. By 1967, more than half of African Americans questioned the logic of war as integral to the concepts of citizenship, equality, and freedom. And it would be this sensibility, this critical consciousness that would shake the civil rights movement. I'm going to talk about this in just a minute, but I do want to remind us as I'm speaking that it's on April 4th, 1967, that Martin Luther King Jr. would deliver his anti-war speech at Riverside Church in New York, 1 year, exactly 1 year before he was assassinated on April 4th, 1968. But he would speak from decades of African-American agitation against participation in wars, because many African-Americans considered war inimical to their fight for racial and economic justice. How could you call for racial justice when you yourself are at war against other people of color around the world? And here African Americans were implicating themselves in the perpetuation of violence. And I think this is extraordinary that we see in 1967 two events happen. For the first time, African Americans would collectively speak out against war in the midst of war. And the second was that they were uncoupling participation in war with the rights of citizenship. And this would challenge the civil rights movement to address long-standing questions. I want to just, for a few minutes, talk about this history of anti-war activism, because I think it's one of the hidden histories that we often see, that anti-war activism beginning with Martin Luther King Jr. And while I think he would become the most visible and most reviled of the anti-war activists, he came from a community, and many of these activists trained him. They would include William Worthy and William Patterson, Bayard Rustin, Septima Clark, and Ella Baker. Benjamin Mays, who was at Morehouse and trained Martin Luther King Jr., was perhaps one of the most long-standing anti-war activists and had traveled the world and spoke to King about these issues. They would galvanize their arguments not in the Vietnam War, but in the Korean War, a war that we know too little about. And myself, when I began to do this study, I thought, all right, I'm going to have to write about Korea. And then I wrote 2 chapters about Korea because I discovered it is really the turning point in much of our history and that we need to know more about it. It would be these activists who understood the cost for ordinary African Americans who participated in, witnessed, or questioned America's wars. They understood the enormity of violence on their struggles for freedom in a global context. "Just carve on my tombstone," one soldier told Horace Cayton in 1942, "here lies a black man who died fighting a yellow man for the protection of a white man." During the Korean War and after, this question of how African Americans might achieve equality and freedom by killing others took on new urgency as increasing numbers prepared for or found themselves facing non-white men on battlefields across Asia, the Middle East, and the Caribbean. Part of the segregated occupation forces in Okinawa just after World War II, James Foreman, who later became a civil rights activist, had become an occupier. He watched black soldiers brandish guns and claim the power of the United States military against other brown people, even as they served in a segregated military. As many Americans, including African Americans, espoused the revitalizing powers of democracy through the integrated battlefield during the Korean War and the Vietnam War, some black soldiers asked how killing, including killing women and children, advanced racial equality. Mired in the horror of the battlefield, Curtis Morrow asked in 1950, "Whatever had these people done to me?" This question, crafted on the battlefields of Asia during the 1950s and honed in the violence of the Vietnam War a decade later, informed the consciousness of increasing numbers of black soldiers and Marines, including Muhammad Ali. And again, we're back to 1966 and 1967, where we will have a confluence of these questions erupt in King's speech, but also in Muhammad Ali taking on how the draft worked. And he would force President Lyndon Baines Johnson to do a review of how it was that the United States draft system worked, and that African Americans had little access to the draft, and it would be that little access that would lead to disproportionate numbers of being drafted. And as you recall, Ali would win his case, and it was a profound moment in the United States when Americans began to ask, how do we draft our young men? And it would eventually lead to the volunteer military. The other issue for anti-war activists was very much linked to everyday life in Black America. When blacks left the military, many returned to segregation and lived on the outskirts of full citizenship. Much of what they struggled for in their own communities, including equal access to employment, the right to vote, equal education, and an end to racial violence, was subverted by an anti-communist rhetoric that tolerated incremental change in black civil rights at best and tacitly or explicitly accepted racial violence and their political suppression. The majority in the generation that fought for democracy in World War II lived in segregation for decades after, and then many sent their sons off to war in Vietnam in a period of dramatic racial struggles when their sons and daughters attended substandard schools, struggled to find work, and remained excluded from or on the margins of the franchise. I remember as my father went off to Vietnam in 1966, we traveled from Fort Benning, Georgia to California so that he could then go. And we took the southern route because it was winter. And we wore our dog tags in case something happened to us while we were traveling. And this is not a minor point. There were black soldiers still being murdered in the South for wearing the uniform of the United States military. And this memory was so deep in me. And recently I was at the Du Bois Institute talking about this project, and there were other African Americans and Hispanics in the group that I was speaking to, whose fathers had been in the military, and they remembered doing exactly the same thing, traveling across the South wearing dog tags. Indeed, wars abroad fueled violence at home. Emmett Till, for example, was murdered by two veterans, one a World War II veteran and the other a Korean War veteran. And they prided their ability to pistol whip him and then tie a gin fan around his neck, because they had done that to the Nazis. And they saw what they were doing in the South as keeping their communities safe from full democracy, voting, and education, and the like. It would be the Mississippi Democratic Freedom Party that would be the first civil rights group to denounce the Vietnam War, and when they issued this statement in July 1965, they urged black mothers to keep their sons out of the draft and black men in the military to reject their orders to go to war. The mainstream civil rights movement rebuked this statement. SNCC's anti-war statement, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, would issue a statement in January of 1966, and it would begin a profound shift in the the anti-war movement and in the Black civil rights movement. And as I said, King would issue his statement in 1967. But all of these statements and positions would come from having spoken directly to men who were on the battlefield. And I think it's important for us to understand that blacks' consciousness about the ideologies and tactics that simultaneously justified war and fueled violent massive resistance to integration and that reshaped their 20th century freedom struggles and would galvanize them to think about how violence in the military worked. And it would be these men coming out of the battlefields, off of the battlefields, or these men who were going to be sent to the battlefields who would reshape not just the civil rights movement, but I would argue American politics in general. And that it is important for us to understand the role of soldiers in American political life. My research has been on the experience of African Americans in reshaping political struggles and understanding civil rights and understanding the links between war and citizenship. But I would argue that there are claims to be made for a study of American history more generally. I think we understand that as we look to a military that is now staffed by volunteers. And I don't think that we should be complacent about that staffing. We still rely on a military that largely comes from the black, white, and Hispanic working class. And the military still remains the one route up the economic ladder. For women, particularly women of color, it is the one institution that provides health care and access to child care for their children. And it is, combat provides additional pay. This was an issue in 1963, and it remains an issue in the 21st century. African Americans remain still very much visible in the 21st century military. They would go into Iraq at numbers that are actually quite shocking, at 25% of the uniformed ranks. And black women in uniform, their numbers and their percentages are even higher. Over the course of these two very long wars, that number has dropped dramatically. The other percentage that is quite high that we should note is that on the eve of the war in Iraq, African Americans, over 58% opposed the war, and it would climb dramatically to 85%. And I think it presents still one of the great paradoxes. How do we explain African Americans' extraordinary participation in the military and their extraordinarily high critique of war? Added to this question from me, African Americans have moved by simply being participants in war to being its architects. And we see this trend during Vietnam, but we were most visibly reminded of it in the early 1990s when General Colin Powell would be the architect of the strategy in the Gulf War, and again, the architect of the strategy in Iraq. And then we now have an African-American president serving in his second term. I think, as I stood and watched him in his first inauguration, as he passed through that causeway and the incredible transfer of power as the military personnel saluted him. That is extraordinary. In my lifetime, I did not imagine that it would be a black man who would be commander-in-chief. And with it goes extraordinary responsibility. And African Americans have been highly critical of President Obama about how he has still remained committed to some tactics and policies that many find problematic. And so certainly the progressive anti-war wing of the Black Caucus and the like have been deeply critical. And indeed, the entire Black Caucus, save for one, voted against going to war. For the men and women on the ground, we still know little about what that experience has been, a war that has had extraordinary a high cost in injury and death, and we're just beginning to recover it. Remarkably, African Americans have been the most reticent about their experiences in battle. You will find few memoirs from Vietnam and fewer still from these two most current wars. You will find, however, rap music to be most explicit about what it has been like to walk point, and it's where I want to end. Two extraordinary compilations of rap music have been produced by soldiers. One included women. The second came from the 1st Cavalry Division. And here they express what I have seen not just in the literature but in my own life, that they will do a soldier's duty with pride and they wear their uniforms with dignity. Since the early 20th century, African Americans have argued there's got to be a better way besides war. No other group in America has consistently and in such high percentages made such a claim, and no other group has so consistently and disproportionately served in the American military. Unraveling the paradox of Black freedom, the military, and war has remained elusive. Listen to me, Starr pleaded in the closing lines of War. Here he repeated the demands of communities mourning their war dead. War can't give life, it can only take it away. Now their granddaughters, their nieces and nephews walk point in the streets of Baghdad and Kabul chanting. I've been around the block, I've seen what's happening. This is just a game to some of you, but the rest of us are not laughing. Got out here like slaves fresh off the ship, where you would see us pick your cotton. No, I ain't mad. I'm a soldier. I'll kill for my country. I'm only pissed because you brought me all the way out here. And it's a very expletive word that I cannot use on television, but to say that African Americans understand what a soldier's duty is, but they also understand its great and extraordinary cost. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dean Phillips. I think that your book and your presentation is extraordinarily persuasive in terms of questioning this essential element of the conventional narrative about 1948 and desegregation in the military as a turning point in the civil rights struggle, and I think also forcing your readers and all of us to reconsider the oversimplification, perhaps, of what happened then. But isn't there also still a powerful argument that the desegregation of the military and massive service by African Americans, beginning with World War II, also began a series of events that did nonetheless have highly consequential positive impact on African American lives in terms of even in World War II, the concerns about black patriotism led to some efforts by FDR's administration to take steps to deal with racial injustice, the participation of so many American soldiers who came from poor backgrounds in the same ways that white soldiers coming from isolated provincial backgrounds were changed culturally. So many American figures like Harry Belafonte and Sidney Poitier and many substantial leaders came through the military in that period of time, setting the stage for the civil rights movement, and then accelerating to what you talked about at the end. Finally, when with figures like Colin Powell emerging through a much more equitable military where buses and movie theaters were desegregated years earlier than in any other part of American society, and ultimately setting the stage for a black president. But it does seem there is a kind of an inherent contradiction, in a sense, between the weakness in the oversimplification that you've identified, but that nonetheless.
I think it's a really important question. And I think the answer is it probably requires more time than I can give it here. But I think it does expose something that I find troubling, in that it is probably one of the most integrated institutions in American life, but integrated in particular ways. And I also always ask, why is it still the only integrated institution in American life? And so the reverberations of that we see too little of. Its impact on African American life, I think, has been extraordinary. Some of the most respected members of black communities have been men and women who've served in the military, and certainly that experience has reshaped black communities in powerful ways, from jobs to healthcare to education and the like. And one of the things that I didn't have enough time to discuss in this book, but others have started to discuss, is that many African Americans who would come into the military were also removed from the military in quite draconic ways. And so just as we see, for example, the high incarceration rate of African Americans, we also see an extraordinarily high incarceration rate in the military and the removal of them under dishonorable discharges. Some of it forced and fabricated. And certainly, to just give you an example, well into the early 1960s, African Americans were dishonorably discharged for standing up against segregation. They were brought up on court-martial charges. Jackie Robinson was brought up on court-martial charges during World War II because he refused to get up off the segregated bus on a military base, even though that military bus was violating a Memorandum 97, which said no more segregation on military bases. Fortunately, he had a really good lawyer, and he left honorably, but many African-American soldiers did not have that luxury. And so the benefits of service, I think, have been far more complicated than we realize, and they haven't translated easily into everyday life. To just give you a more recent example, and I think it impacts black and white, Hispanic soldiers, men and women, veterans going out today trying to find a job are treated like they were criminals. And I think it's one of the extraordinary things, too, about how the shift in how we perceive the military. And I'll just use African Americans as an example, but I think it's the canary in the coal mine. And that is, during World War II and the Korean War, they were perceived as unsuited to military service. By Vietnam War, when many Americans began to see the military soldiers as problematic, African Americans were seen as ideally suited to being soldiers. And indeed, even in left journals and the like, they called them, ghetto dwellers, ideally suited to the military. They were mercenaries and the like. And so, I think I would have a better answer, a more hopeful answer for you, if in fact I thought the military and the perception of people in the military had remained high. It has not, and maybe it has not at all. I think, as historians, we need to pay more attention to the social and cultural experience of military life. But I think for African Americans, it's been far more complex.
Oh, Professor Phillips, thank you so much for an outstanding presentation. I bought your book, and I'll be looking for your signature shortly. My name is Marcus Martin. I'm Vice President and Chief Officer for Diversity and Equity here at UVA. And, of course, I want to thank you and Miller Center for the presentation today. The Office for Diversity and Equity has coordinated 30 events for the MLK celebration over the course of the next 2 to 3 weeks. And so we're so happy that you were included within our array of presentations. On January 13th, the first presentation was held at a local African American church. Mm-hmm. And I had the privilege of talking about the topics that would be covered during the MLK celebration. And when I mentioned your talk, War, what is it good for? In unison, everybody said, absolutely nothing. So just want to report that to you. That's true to form, absolutely nothing. Question I have for you. In 1948, when President Truman signed the executive order for equality in the armed forces, from that point on, in your research, did you see any differences or disparities in terms of equal or unequal treatment in the armed services branches, for instance, comparing Army, Navy, and Air Force, particularly related to skills and progression in rank?
That's a great question. I think many African Americans found the Air Force, for example, to be far more open to their presence, and I think part of it was, if you remember, the Air Force was really the Army Air Corps, and it was organized after World War II, 1946, and it would be the Tuskegee Airmen who become really part of the center of the new Air Force, and the Air Force is nearly integrated by 1950. And that had a tremendous impact on African Americans' perception of possibility in the military, and that there would be a shift. Many more would seek to go into the Air Force because of that. The Navy was far more resistant to African Americans and had really confined them to two areas, mess and labor units. And and you'll see that today in the ranks. There are far fewer African Americans in the Navy, although it's significantly more than it was at any other time in the U.S. history. The Army and the Marine Corps, because they were ground troops, because they used infantry, and the Army and the Marines are very diverse. You have the engineers and you have military intelligence and the like. And some of those units, some of those branches were open to African Americans, others were not. The Engineer Corps, for example, long had African Americans, and so African Americans found access to it. And I think, again, doing more research, we might find the networks of association that were helpful. I would say one of the most interesting things that I've found since I started doing this work and thinking about the 21st century military, how many sons and daughters have followed fathers and mothers into the service, and that there are multiple generations in uniform today.
Professor Phillips, thank you. People have been fighting one another since time immemorial, partially because they're either unable or unwilling to talk to one another. Every time I think about the 4,500 soldiers that were killed in Iraq, and every time I go by the Vietnam War Memorial and see the name of 56,000 soldiers that were killed there, I wonder if one of those could have been able to discover a cure for cancer or a cure for autism. And when is it that we as people here in the 21st century are going to start to talk to one another in order to prevent wars?
I will have to say that thinking about violence and thinking about the very points you've made really animated my research. And I certainly think that we need to bring that to a public discussion about what happens to the body politic, what happens to all of us when we leave, as I call it, the work of killing to 18, 19, and 20-year-olds. And in other societies, they're frequently much younger. As Hendrik says, you've sent children to do the work that diplomats cannot do. And I say this not just as a philosophical, but having grown up, as I said, in a military family and listening to my father in 1972, 1973 in Berlin, where he was commander of a brigade, and at night would wake up and he'd get a phone call because a soldier had died of an overdose of drugs It was really rampant during the Vietnam War. And hearing him weep and understand, so the aftermath of war is extraordinary. The grief we carry as a nation, the resources that we waste. And I think that's precisely what African Americans were raising this question. We can trivialize war, what is it good for? But we have to really, it's a really important question. What does it do to us as a people? And so you're right, it's an incredible waste of talent and of ourselves.
I congratulate you on a beautiful lecture. It's something we all ought to think about and ponder. I want to relate very quickly two experiences I've had. One of them coming home in 1968. I was a paratrooper, and that was my first and last experience of war. Just before the plane landed, there were about 250 GIs on the plane. We flew from Tan Son Nhut to Yokosuka, and we landed somewhere in Washington State. A voice said, "You gentlemen be well advised to change into civilian attire before leaving this post." And we didn't think too much of it at the time. Most of us were drunk. We'd been up all night. We were very happy. In 1991, I was sitting with my wife on a plane from Philadelphia to Miami, and Operation Desert Storm had just occurred. And a voice said, "Please remain seated when we come to the gate. We have young soldiers who have just returned from Operation Desert Storm, and we'd like them to get off the plane first." There was instant applause and cheering as these young people made their way forward. They were embraced and hugged. And nowadays, when we walk through airports, most of us routinely, when we see GIs, we go up and thank them for their service or hug them. I was on a plane the other day in which all first-class seats that were empty were filled with GIs who were the first to get on the plane. Suddenly, we have taken these military people to our bosom. They are prosecuting a war which seems to me to be far more senseless, if possible, than what we were doing in Vietnam. What about that? We are so remote from what is happening in Afghanistan. It was not an issue in the election campaign, and yet it just goes on like an Orwellian offstage war. And nobody seems to care except when we see the people who we call on to fight it, and we thank them for their service. I'd like to have your ideas about that.
Mr. Bunting, I remember, it was in 1968, it was 1970, when my father came back from Vietnam the second time, and we greeted him. He was alone and in his civilian clothes. When he came back in 1966, he was still in uniform, so the transformation was extraordinary. You're absolutely right. And I would argue that it was actually the Vietnam War Memorial, which you mentioned, that changed all of that. I think that there was a real public conversation about how Americans had treated soldiers. And I think, interestingly enough, the Vietnam War Memorial would come up, and it wasn't only after the Vietnam War Memorial that a memorial for the Korean War veterans came up. And that, too, is extraordinary. They call it the forgotten war. And so I think we have a long history of ignoring, people that we send off. I mean, I think there are several people in this room who could join in the conversation about the ways in which ordinary people who bear the burden of these events are then summarily forgotten. They live with wounds for decades after, and so do their families. I know that for a fact. I grew up with teenagers, kids, whose fathers had been in endless war, and the kids are a mess. And the grief that descended into these households. And so I would say people are applauding. I've seen it. Go through Atlanta Airport, which is one of the staging, is coming in from Ramstein and the like. That's a staging ground. But please do go up and ask them, how many tours have they done? 4, 5, 6 tours that they've done? So yes, people are applauding now, and that's really great that we're doing that. But I think that we would back away if we had a conversation. And the impact on military family life is extraordinary. My brother served. My oldest brother just retired. So I can tell you the impact on military families. It's right that Mrs. Obama and Mrs. Biden Dr. Biden have focused on that, because as a society, we may applaud, and I'm glad that we do, but we should also ask, why are they doing 4 and 5 tours? Just as you've said. Yes, it just makes us feel better.
I have a sort of an experience in my own lifetime as a military person at the end of the beginning of the Truman administration. And I found myself in Europe as a young lieutenant in the infantry who suddenly became the assistant curriculum chief of the Army's Information and Educational Staff School. And have you ever heard of a fellow named Bilbo?
Yes.
Okay. He was a little upset because we had been teaching in there, and as the assistant curriculum chief, I was helpful in setting up some courses, including one on prejudice. Mm-hmm. And that sort of disturbed him. Mm-hmm. So he had his son, a colonel, come and investigate us for about maybe 2 weeks, and which was a rather disturbing type thing when you're trying to conduct a class and you're sitting back with a colonel in the back giving you the eye the whole time. We passed the test, primarily because the only discrimination we had at that point that we were concerned about was the discrimination of the American troopers against the French, because the Germans had better plumbing. Mm-hmm. And so we had to convince them that that was a sort of a thing you shouldn't worry about too much. But my assistant, my secretary, was a girl who was a former resistance participant. And this gets back to women today in the military and in combat. She carried with her a small caliber pistol to get the 2 people who had killed her father in Belgium. She was known as Madame X in the Belgian underground. It's not unusual to find women participating in the underground in Europe during that period.
Yes.
So I just wanted to point out that there's nothing new about women being in combat. Secondly, as far as the discrimination is concerned, that has vastly changed today, and it's such a great thing to see. I feel myself that one of the important things for us to do is to get to the point where we realize ourselves, whether we're white, whether we're black, Mexican, Chinese, or whatever, we're essentially anybody who's a citizen of this United States, these United States, are Americans. Thank you.
Yes. One comment I'll add to that, there are many historians that are working in U.S. colleges and universities, my generation, and I'm proud to say I'll be 53 this year, who's mostly fathers. I have a couple whose mothers were in the military, but were in the military as the military was integrating. And it was a profound and transformational experience for their parents and for their children. And that I would say, again, the sort of reverberations of this, I think, have been tremendous, not just for African Americans, but for many Americans as well. And I think I urge people to take this topic up, to really understand exactly what has happened to us as a people when we have been at endless war and we have had a growing military for such a long time. And to disentangle some of the institutional elements of the military that are beneficial. You talked about education. I think the military organized education for significant populations of men and women that forever changed their lives and provided for their families. Healthcare is another, just tremendous. Diet is another. The infrastructure that would be put in place across the United States, from roads to schools to buildings to institutions. And we should ask ourselves, can't we do that in a peace economy? Shouldn't we be doing that instead of an economy of war? And to give you just one last example, United States, during the earthquake in Haiti, it sent a ship. And they sent 2 ships. One ship was filled with doctors, and they worked through the injured and the sick in a quite profound way. The other was a ship that took seawater and turned it into fresh water. That's extraordinary to me, just extraordinary. And we wonder again and again, resources that we could amass in an institution for good, that we could be doing that at home and abroad. Absolutely. It can absolutely transform American lives and other lives as well.
We've only got time for one more question from the audience, but I wanted to quickly ask you to comment as well on, I think that you don't phrase it this way in your book, but you seem to also be establishing a separation between the notion of loyalty and patriotism, and that African Americans, over time, sometimes inexplicably, showed tremendous loyalty again and again, but over time began to have doubts about what we think of as patriotism, and this failure to acknowledge their service fully and sufficiently. Is that what Michelle Obama was, in a sense, referring to when she said, "I'm, for the first time, proud of my country"? I mean, is that a sense among African Americans more generally? Is that what that was about?
Well, I'm not going to try to articulate what Mrs. Obama was thinking. And I think though that what she might have tapped into, in which I think many people don't quite understand. Well, I'm actually going to quote Arthur Miller, which I was actually going to use here today, but didn't. But now's a good time to do it. The playwright Arthur Miller went into the South during World War II. He was asked by the War Department to write a script for a film about the military. So he went in and he did lots of interviews, and he spent time with black and white troops in what I believe is Fort Stewart. And he watched black troops who were hauling white troops out of ditches, didn't know quite what they were doing, but the black troops did, because they were the technical people, what he called the shadow military. And he rode in a Jeep with a black man who had been a lawyer, in his community, but was now a private in the United States Army because the military refused to make him an officer. In any case, this lawyer, now private, said to Arthur Miller, "I'm proud to wear the American uniform. It claims that I'm an American, but don't you think it just really gets at what the problem is that I'm wearing the uniform for a country that refuses to let me live?" And I think that it's, you talk to many African Americans, and they will talk about a long view, a long history. And I think maybe that's what Mrs. Obama was getting at, this long history of black Americanness being questioned, black patriotism being questioned. And even as, black people have been first on the battlefield, the last to leave. And remember, they were doing that in the midst of a war where the FBI was investigating black loyalty.
As I'm sure you know, a lot of studies have come out in the last decade that look at the way that veterans' benefits were systematically denied to African Americans, particularly in the wake of the Second World War, but continuing well into the 60s. And I'm wondering to what extent the systematic denial of veterans' benefits factored into this debate that you discovered within the community that looked at the relationship between military service and the pursuit of racial justice.
Oh, I think it had an extraordinary impact, because if you're thinking about veterans' benefits that were around housing, education, businesses, access to institutions, the right to vote. I mean, I think that was one of the most galvanizing experiences for blacks and some white Southerners who would back into the South. We're still having to pay poll taxes. Theodore Bilbo, senator from Mississippi, used that tactic to great effect in keeping blacks and poor whites away from polls. And so the idea that there should be some recompense for one's service was widespread. But too little access, and not just for African Americans, but for Hispanic Americans and for women. And to give you just one concrete example, the veteran benefits for education, when colleges and universities across the South excluded African Americans. And so there was a far more limited pool available to African Americans in terms of going to school and redlining of homes and the like, and the impact on education. And so that's my point about living on the outskirts of American life, that even the benefits of service could not be used fully. Thank you.